Hello, we're so glad that you joined us for a walk in the garden. I'm Penny Lewis, Executive Director of the Ecological Landscape Alliance. Welcome to gardeners across the United States and to our international guests. As we continue to cope with the challenges of the pandemic, we hope that these weekly virtual garden walks will add a bit of beauty to your day and inspire you to visit, create, and enjoy gardens in your area. Today, I would like to introduce Darrah Cole, whose garden walk will guide us through spring ephemerals and bulbs. Darrah is a senior horticulturist and designer at the Greenway Conservancy, the nonprofit responsible for managing the Greenway in Boston. Before joining the Conservancy staff in 2011, Darrah managed private historic estate gardens. Darrah is passionate about ecological practices and has actively employed organic growing and land care methods for 25 years. Welcome, Darrah.
Good morning, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you, Penny, for that great introduction, and also to you and ELA for sponsoring this series of walks. So I am going to take people through the Greenway, which is in Boston, and we'll be looking at the ephemerals and bulbs, a selection of them that we have there. So quick introduction to ephemerals, if you're not familiar with what that term means. These are plants that emerge and bloom in the spring each year. They then die back and are dormant by mid to late summer. And they generally will have corms, tubers, or fleshy roots, which help them store the carbohydrates and the food they need to rebloom the next spring. And they will often form colonies and clumps. They thrive in shaded woodlands, and they benefit from the added sun that they get in the spring before the trees leaf out. I love ephemerals because they are the first flowers that bloom in the spring. They're often delicate, and their fleeting nature just makes them all that more attractive. Bulbs, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, some bulbs. We often see tulips, daffodils, and crocus in many yards, but there are also a lot of other bulbs, some of them more common, some of them from faraway places, because they're easy to travel. In the sense, when they are dormant, they're just sort of like a big seed. And so they have been traded and collected throughout the world. And so a lot of different global regions are represented in bulbs that we now cultivate and grow in the United States. They grow as single and multi-stem plants from bulbs and corms. They reproduce by seed, but also by division into sets, or just increasing their bulb, almost like a bulb of garlic that you might be familiar with. And then they also replenish their nutrition with the foliage after they flower, and then that foliage goes dormant again, usually by midsummer. So this is a picture of a Erythronium americanum, which is one of the few native bulbs. It has naturalized itself in small places, but this one is on the edge of my lawn in Rockport, Massachusetts. Unfortunately, we do not have any of these growing in the Greenway, but this is the Greenway, an aerial shot of the Greenway. And I'm just going to bring my little cursor up here, and you'll see, if you see my mouse moving around on the left side of the screen, this is the very southern part of the Greenway. It starts in Chinatown, and it continues through Dewey Square, and then into the WHARF area here downtown near the waterfront in Boston, and then up and towards, this is the Faneuil Hall area, and then into the north end of Boston. So that is our contemporary urban park in downtown Boston that we will be walking through today. We have over 700 species of plants, so pretty robust horticulture for an urban park. We have had a bulb planting program ongoing for the last 10 years, and we have over 150,000 bulbs. That's at a minimum that we have planted on the Greenway. Again, it encompasses many different species of bulbs. And we strive for lush horticulture in our urban setting, in our small, in our narrow park. The park is built over the 93 tunnel that goes through downtown Boston, and it opened in 2009, early 2009, late 2008. The Rose Kennedy Greenway Conservancy is a nonprofit which has a lease with the State Department of Massachusetts, Transportation of Massachusetts, to manage and maintain the park. And so we do all of that, and here we go. So we manage our horticulture organically and sustainably with ecological principles. And this is a little preview shot of some fritillaria bulbs that are in the southern end of the park in Chinatown. And we do put signage throughout the park, both talking about different areas of the park, different gardens in the park, and here's one talking about some of our organic maintenance procedures. This Chinatown is right next to Chinatown community. This is the traditional Chinese gate that leads you into Chinatown, and our park is sort of between the gate and the street and runs about 2 or 3 blocks long in a narrow strip along the street here. It is a lively community, and there's a large plaza along with a number of different planting beds in Chinatown. They use the plaza for cultural events and community events and celebrations throughout the year. There are bamboo, a lot of traditional Chinese and Asian plants that are planted in the garden from the original design. And then we have added in most of the bulbs that appear in Chinatown today. So at the south end of Chinatown is a small garden we call the viewing garden. It is set behind a gate for now, which allows us to grow slightly more tender or perhaps unique plants, but it gets less foot traffic and is a little more protected than some other areas of the Greenway. And here we have our first early bulbs of the season, the little fritillaria meleagris coming up along with the ostrich fern. And I have another shot of it combined with epimedium sulphureum, which we're able to see blooming. And while epimediums are not considered ephemerals, they are an early spring blooming plant. And as the new foliage is emerging, the flowers rise above it. So this is the best time to observe those flowers. The foliage will continue to get a little taller and will shade out the flowers, and it will persist into the late fall. But this is a wonderful time for, again, that whole sense of new beginnings in the spring and sort of fresh growth on all the plants. This is Fritillaria imperialis rubra, also in that viewing garden, and it can just be a stunning plant. I think the bloom stands about 2.5 feet tall, so it's quite a grand looking flower, and I tend to plant them relatively sparsely because they are so impressive. It's nice to really capitalize on how stunning they are. This is a small lily I think it's considered in the lily family. Its common name is lavender mountain lily. It is native to regions of China and also sometimes called the Siberian lily. So any other parts of Asia. And it blooms a little later in the spring. The liriope behind it is pretty much fully grown in. I would say it blooms in late May and early June. And here it is. You can see it's a kind of a tall It's a delicate flower on a taller stem, and does really well, and has been, again, quite reliable for a small bulb. And so I've come to really count on it in an area where we don't always have a lot of colorful blooming things. It's a nice addition to peonies and azaleas, which are the other main flowers in the Chinatown Park. We plant hybrid tulips only, pretty much exclusively in the containers for this spring show, and we put them in early November and keep our fingers crossed. I've had 1 or 2 years when they have not performed well due to the winter weather, but most years we get a good show of tulips in our containers, and it buys us a little extra time when we're busy out in the gardens cleaning up and doing other things in the spring, not to have to put that time in March and April in making something really showy happen in our containers. This is a new tulip for us, Tulip Bakeri Lilac Wonder, and it is a species tulip. We put primarily species tulips, or almost exclusively species tulips, in the park, and so we have a growing collection of them. Some have performed better than others. They definitely prefer well-draining soil. These are planted in an area that somewhat simulates a scree gravel type garden, and these have just been very, very showy this year. This is, again, the first year that we've had them in. And here is a close-up. I would say these are still blooming 3 weeks later, still looking great in this location. They have this great cupped shape and this bright yellow interior. So nice. As we move down the park, we'll come to DEWEY Square, which has a large plaza. It's the busiest center in the city, right next to South Station, and it has a mural. Our public art department manages a number of contemporary pieces of public art. And they are considered temporary in that they are set in the park anywhere from 3 to 18 months. And so this mural changes almost annually, but this is the mural that's currently on the wall. And this is our demonstration area on the left-hand side in the DEWEY Square area. We have quite a few bulbs there. Again, spring containers. This is Tulip Olympic Flame, in with lilacs that are in these pots continually. So the lilacs stay in year round and just have now been in there for 3 or 4 years. We have good success with shrubs and trees in our containers. And so as we enter the display garden, the demo area, if we're lucky and happen to catch it, we might catch this Tulip Whittalii blooming at the same time as our cameo quince, our double apricot quince, and it's a really stunning combination. Not every year, it doesn't quite work out every year. We also have a raised bed area where we grow sort of demonstration vegetables. And last year we added an asparagus bed. And so this is the first year that they're coming up. And while it's not an ephemeral, it almost falls into that classification. And I couldn't resist showing off the asparagus growing just feet from busy South Station. Here we are where a lot of, we've lined both sides of the path with different daffodils and narcissus and planted tulips in irrigation tub that we use. We will probably pull those bulbs out of that tub and put them somewhere else later, and then plant vegetables in that same tub. This is Tulip Daydream with, I think, Narcissus Sunlight Sensation, a small flowering narcissus. Here is one of the first sort of true ephemerals that we will come across walking down the park, and this is Calthus palustris, a native plant that is known as marsh marigold. It loves boggy areas or areas that are damp in the spring, and it's quite a substantial plant. It's got these wonderful, not waxy, but they're very sturdy leaves, and this bright gold yellow flower. So it's great, and if it's happy, it will colonize itself fairly steadily. Again, here's that tub in another year with a different tulip, Tangerine Beauty. It was stunning that year, and I'm quite sure that, well, I can't. I was trying to say I know that yellow daffodil narcissus in the back is, but I'm not going to remember the name right now. And again, another shot of what I think is Tulip Daydream. You may wonder how we get all our bulbs in the ground, because as you see, in some cases, they're quite generously planted. We plant in the fall, we plant after Halloween and straight into December with our staff and many volunteers. And we work with different corporate groups and individuals and our whole office staff to put in thousands and thousands of bulbs each year. They're all hand dug. We don't use drills, and we lay them out rather casually. I'm not one to say, okay, a bulb at the center of every 4 inches. We come up with a spacing that looks about right, or a number of bulbs per area, and then other staff will help lay them out, as you can see in this fairly generous and naturalistic way. We're moving on from Dewey to Fort Point, and this is a fairly horticulturally diverse area. Here's a shot of as you enter it in the summer. So it's got the perennials. You can see again, it's rather thickly planted. And here it is about this sort of early May. The leaves aren't out on the trees yet. And but we have a dense ground cover there of many bulbs and a few ephemerals. And I love this area. The granite retaining wall there is about 2 feet, maybe a little bit taller than 2 feet. And so it brings the flowers very close to people's face. They can look into the flowers if they're hanging down, or they want to get a close look at them. It's a great way. So if you have that type of situation, it's again a nice aspect to capitalize on, especially with the early spring flowers. This is another fritillaria similar to the other one, but this is a species, Fritillaria radiana. It's the earliest blooming one. It's a very sturdy, and this particular bulb has returned year after year after year. I think we planted it in 2012. So I'm just, if it's not disturbed, we don't need to do a lot of work around it, and it is in a fairly well-draining soil, but I find it's much more predictable or has better longevity than some of the other royal crown fritillaria. So you might look into this fritillaria. Here again, another nice close-up of the epimedium. The sulfurium has again been very reliable, and it increases quite well. It's just a sturdy epimedium. So I've used that one quite a bit throughout, instead of getting too involved in the more. There are just so many wonderful epimediums, but for sort of reliability, I find this is one that I really have come to count on. And here is the Fritillaria meleagris. It comes in sort of mixed colors, so I think you can get only the purple or only the white or a mix of the two. It can be called the checkerboard flower or the guinea hen flower because of that beautiful patterning on the petals and on the bloom. And they do well in sort of in clumps, and they will naturalize and spread around, and they look great in a meadow situation. If you have a meadowy garden and you don't mind putting in something that's not native, this is a great addition. And here is in the background the Mertensia virginiana, the Virginia bluebells, which is one of the few real ephemerals that we use in a number of places throughout the Greenway. And it has just makes a great combination with the fritillaria. And here's a close-up of that blossom, a stunning blue color, and it's got fairly wide, fairly slightly light green leaves. The leaves don't have a lot of structure to them, so that's probably not what's gonna get you to keep the plant. It's really more the bloom, and they do go dormant in late July. So if something, so usually by then some larger, taller perennial has grown up in the same area, so you don't get a hole in the garden. Or maybe a ground cover. I've seen it really nicely combined with Tiarella. And here is a Narcissus fragrant rose, a nice sort of pink apricot narcissus with that is fragrant. Again, looking really nice with that same fritillaria. And this is Anemone sylvestris, sort of here I am stretching the boundaries of what might be ephemeral, but it's a very early spring bloomer, a sort of ground covering, spreading anemone. And but the foliage does persist later into the year, into the fall. And here you can see what a nice sort of gentle clump it makes. The flowers are fairly large, and the foliage is fairly gentle. It is not as aggressive a spreader as the anemone canadensis, which has got a taller flower stem. I would say these are roughly about a foot high here. And then moving on, this is sort of on the other side of that area. And oh, I'm going to use my little cursor here. Whoops, I forgot to put it away. I'm so sorry. Right in here is a clump of Iphion, and they're more further on down the path. And so here it is. It has naturalized. This is an allium relative, really sweet, pale blue flower. And it's nice to stick in places. It is not thuggish in that way, although we haven't found any reason to remove it. And the foliage will, again, go dormant. And then if it's too messy looking or something isn't covering it up, we just rake it off. So here's a close-up, the Iphion uniflorum. There are some selective cultivars of this same plant that are a darker blue, but this one, as I say, is just doing great where it is, and we've been enjoying it with that great pale blue star flower and the tight yellow center. Looking over again, you can see 2 or 3 different clumps, large clumps of narcissus throughout that bed. And some of them are early blooming, some mid-season blooming, and some late season blooming. So looking on the other side of that little rise, you can see that we have good selection. Some of these daffodils have already gone by, and then this more pale group is persisting. These are under large leaf magnolias, so this is very shady in the summer. There are not a lot of other plants that grow up, so it's great to get a big kick of color in now. We have many, many narcissus, and I did a quick inventory check, and I could tell we have we have planted at least over 45 different cultivars of narcissus throughout the Greenway. So here are a couple. We just put in Narcissus Martha Stewart last year. If you're a apricot, orange, peachy colored fan and you like that, this one is actually very successful. Beautiful sort of yellow in the back of it. So here it is, just looking straight on, sort of apricot, almost to a strong orange. It's really a great one. This I want to say is Narcissus Ginter's Gem, and then I hesitate. I think maybe it's Yellow Sailboat. I think of Ginter's Gem as being a little, it's very similar, but I think it's a little more yellow and that the petals are a little more reflect. So I apologize if I've got the wrong name on it. This is Narcissus Manly, a double. We have a couple areas that we planted with these double Narcissus, and this one has turned out to be very sturdy. It's come back year after year. It's planted under an elm tree, so there's not too much growing underneath it, but there are shrubs, dogwoods, and hydrangeas that sort of fill the area after the Narcissus are finished. Here is Fragrant Rose, another one of the pink apricot varieties. This is Narcissus Leike with a small but clear yellow center, and then another double cheerfulness. Here's another selection of groupings of species tulips, and they have thinned out over time. So this was the first year it was planted, but we have Clusiana Lady Jane, then Antinka. And so you can see they make for really wonderful stand, very delicate. Moving on, we have another area of the park with some Narcissus hawera planted under that tree, and this is it in another section where it works really well in a big clump, and it will naturalize on its own. It gets a little beefier each year. We have Lathyrus vernus, which is again not quite in the ephemeral category in that the foliage will persist into the fall, but it is again very early spring blooming. And I thought it might seed in a lot, but in fact it has not proven to seed in. It stays in these nice clumps. And then we have Trillium grandiflorum, the ultimate sort of Northeast native, true ephemeral. It will grows from sort of a corm type bulb and will flowers early, and then the leaves will start drying up and desiccating in late July into August, and as the plant goes dormant. And that is, if you have a vast clump of them, that's a good time to transplant them. It is not allowed to dig these up if you see them wild in the woods. That's not what you want to do. You can purchase them from reliable nurseries that have not harvested them in the wild. They need to be cultivated by the nursery. And so definitely look to the Native Plant Trust at their garden shop at the Garden in the Woods in Massachusetts is one source for these that I would recommend. We'll move on to another area of the park where the central walkway is through the center, and we're a little shielded from the two side streets, busy traffic from downtown Boston. And so you enter under these wonderful taxodiums with this understory of native plants. We have Podophyllum mayapple and Erycema canonensis, the ginger, wild ginger. And then we have Eranthus hymalis, which is the winter aconite. And they've been very tricky for us to get established, but we do have a few small groups that seem to come up reliably. And these are the early blooming plants. They bloom usually in early March, perhaps late February, but they're the first little yellow blooms. And I go out looking in the taxodium leaves that have fallen to see these bright yellow flowers. We also have some dicentra in that mix, and so dicentra eczema, wonderful, delicate foliage, almost fern-like, and these pink flowers so luminescent with the sun coming behind them. So it's useful, it's tender, and is considered early spring ephemeral. In the center of this ginger and May apple, you'll see that more gray tone, and that is some erythronium that we managed to get established in these beds. And here are some close-ups of that, Erythronium americana with a pink flower. So that's different than the one that grows natively or naturalized around my house with a yellow flower. Then we have Camassia. These can make a wonderful field or meadow. And this is Camassia Blue Danube. This is a close-up. This grows as a spiky flower and it blooms from the bottom up. So the buds at the top have yet to open. This is another stand of the Mertensia. And you can see in the open area how big the leaves are, kind of soft and floppy, almost like a loose leaf lettuce, but the flowers will stand up quite high above that foliage. So that's why it mixes in well with other plants. And we may see some species Witthalii, species Tulip Witthalii. There are some planted, and they can vary their color a little from a more pale orange to this darker fiery orange, not just from group of bulb to group of bulb, but actually from year to year. Sometimes they vary a little. We do have a large allium collection. I'm not going into the alliums in this presentation at all. They bloom later in May, so they're just starting to bloom now, and they'll bloom through the middle to the end of June, depending on what varieties you have. Stunning plant. I don't mean to overlook them, but I'm moving on. Here is another group of Camassia interplanted with some alliums. So you can see that's quite a nice combination, and the contrast of the shapes of the flowers is great. This brings us to the WHARF district, which is right along the waterfront, and it is planted with all native plants, and that was the original design intent, and we have stuck with that pretty true to form. I'm just gonna click back here for a second. In the WHARF district is our rings fountain. That's sort of if you needed to know that you're in the WHARF district. If you get to the rings fountain, then you're in the native plant area. Here we are. This is a little bit later in the year, just to show context. This is a nice stand of the Aquilegia canadensis, the columbine. It's just starting to bloom now, and this is sort of variable. This stand is sometimes this large, sometimes not. We have for bulbs the Erythronium pagoda. So here I am stretching the boundaries of what's native. It's not a this is a cultivated, selected form of Erythronium, and would not be the species that we would naturally find in the Northeast here, but it adds great contrast in form. The foliage is a great contrast, and the sort of bell-shaped yellow flowers stand up very nicely. It's quite a bit larger in overall stature than the other Erythroniums. Here's a close-up. You can see it's got that very kind of curious mottled foliage, and the flower just starting to bud up there. Here it is again. And then we also have a lot of galanthus. These bloom quite early, much earlier. You know, in March, we've seen actually some early ones on the northeast. On a sunny south or southeast facing slope. They might bloom in February. If there's no snow on the ground. So these are commonly known as snowdrops because of their early bloom time. They're generally, 4 to 8 inches tall, And I'm going to use my cursor again here, that this green shape can sometimes indicate or help indicate the actual species of this genus. That's one of the things you can look at. But we have two different species, the nivalis and the elwesii, and also a cultivated selection, Sam Arnott, and they're just great and very sort of curious plants, lovely plants. I can't get through the WHARF without showing off our native prickly pear cactus. It does bloom in mid-June. It's not an ephemeral, but it's a very unique plant, and we have a great stand of it there in the WHARF district. So sorry to slip that in. Getting closer to the carousel area, we have a lot of chionodoxa that is covers the whole ground of some of these beds as it has naturalized over the last 6 or 7 years. And it's a standout in late March, I think mid-March, late March, depending on the season. And this is sort of a close-up of these star-shaped flowers. And here it is sort of mixed in. It's just beginning to emerge here with the crocus, and the dark purple one is Furnus flower record, crocus Furnus flower record with the chionodoxa. We also have some Scilla siberica spring beauty. We've interplanted that again with the chionodoxa, and it blooms a little bit later, still early bloomer. And this is a plant that you will see, you know, as you drive around, at least where I live, some areas will get this sort of blue glow, and that Scilla was a common bulb for many years in New England. So it has naturalized and taken over whole areas of some slightly tended lawns. I also couldn't resist throwing in just some other early spring growth, the Dischampsia flexuosa with the Fragaria virginiana. Those are native plants with the non-native crocus foliage sort of peaking up. And as I say, that crocus foliage will go dormant in another month or so, and then the other two will have grown over it. And here, this is our carousel again, just a sort of placemaker as you walk down the Greenway. Another container which has a red-twigged variegated leaf dogwood in it, which will fill out very soon, but in the interim, these beautiful hybrid tulips are taking up and adding a lot of color in the early spring. So we will just sort of walk across the Armenian Heritage Park and the meadow. We don't have too many bulbs here. It's a memorial park. Most flowers are in the white or light colored tones, but we do have the tulip turcostanica, another species tulip. It blooms later, so I have not seen any blooming yet, but it also leaves quite a nice seed head. It has the low foliage and kind of tall stems, maybe standing up almost a foot with a delicate flower on it. And we also have some pushkinia, very short. This would only be 3 to 4 to 5 inches tall, very beautiful, one of the earliest bulbs to bloom. And there is some Camassia as we go from Armenian Heritage up to the north end. And we are also going to pass by our wildflower meadow and our beehives, which we planted 2 falls ago. The meadow, we seeded it and then added plants in the spring, last spring. And so now we have Geum triflorum, which is a native plant in the meadow, and that's an early spring bloomer. And we also have Antineria plantaginifolia, pussy toes, which is a great meadow plant, loves dry soil, and it, again, not quite truly an ephemeral in that the low ground covering foliage will persist through the summer and into the fall, but the delicate white flowers certainly are unique to this time of year. And then we are into the North End Park, which is lawn panels and these more formal boxwood beds, although they are still planted with some informality. And so we have the Carolyn Lynch Garden with granite with retaining walls and boxwoods. And it is now, so I'm just going to flip back here. Is it probably in, I want to say, mid-April, and this is sort of early May. The vinca has started blooming and there are some bulbs in there, but again, because of this high retaining wall, I'm always tempted to bring flowers right into people's faces. So I've planted these tulips. There you'll get first your aerial shot of the Carolyn Lynch Garden on the left, and a very contrasting close-up of Erythronium White Beauty that's planted right along that naming wall, and so that people can really see what this delicate flower of maybe 3 to 4 inches looks like. And we have chionodoxa luciliae, which is it's a little more delicate than the Forbiceae blue giant and a little paler, and it is underplanted with, or it underplants a lot of other bulbs and areas throughout these boxwood gardens. Here is a large drift of 3 or 4 kinds of narcissus, mostly white, definitely some Narcissus thalia in there, which is the white, one of the whites that we see. And there are warm season grasses, panicums and butylloa planted that grow up later. So this is a great way to fill the bed while those warm season grasses grow in. Checking my timing here. Good, not too bad. I have a little bit more to go, but if people do have questions, they might submit those in the next 5 or 10 minutes or so. This is a shot of that vinca. You can see some hellebores in there and different species tulips. This is a very refined species tulip, Tulip of Battellini Bronze Charm. I have totally fallen in love with this tulip, and here behind it you can see the red in the distance, the red of the maple flowers and yellow daffodil blooming, and then the sort of the violet of the vinca flowers. But this tulip will open up. It's very long lasting. I have some other pictures of it, so you haven't seen the end of it yet. This is a Muscari armenicum Valerie finis. The Muscari, I love the pale blue of this Muscari. We have Muscari in a few other spots. This is the first year for this one. I'm hoping that it enjoys the location and settles in. The Muscari will put up some foliage in the fall and then bloom like this in the spring. And here's more of the Carolyn Lynch beds, full, just chock full of narcissus and spring blooming bulbs. So the white one with the orange center is Narcissus Barrett Browning, and it is combined or put in next to Carlton, which is a sort of classic yellow daffodil, and fairly early flowering. Those are both fairly early flowering bulbs, and you see it combined here with a Runcus Misty Lace and a Knockout Rose. And here's a close-up of that Carlton, and then Narcissus Yellow Sailboat. And then here is that same tulip from a slightly different angle in a different location. So this one is planted in another bed, but up on the edge of a stone retaining wall. There are granite retaining walls with Deutzia gracilis, and the tulip will die back. The Deutzia continues to always put on a fair amount of new growth after it blooms in the spring, and there are other perennials that will grow up around it. And I just can't say enough about this tulip this year and its wonderful peachy, rich color with this glaucous blue foliage. And we'll move on to my next favorite species tulip. And so here we have Narcissus bittern with Tulipa praetens shogun, the tangerine tulip in the back. It's got a much greener foliage and it's very upright. And then this small flowering narcissus with multiple, I think multiple flowers on a stem is Narcissus bittern. I wanted something equally colorful to be able to balance the tulip here. This again, Tulipa shogun. It has a wonderful dark center and again, fairly long blooming, and it's been quite reliable and actually can increase slowly over the years. And I think we're winding down our bulb talk. We have some more of that nice Tulipa turcostanica under the pergola in the north end. If you don't have any grounds where you can plant bulbs safely, try a container, even in this harsh winter climates, as long, they manage to somehow make it through and give a great show in the spring. And that is our another shot of the north end. So I really would invite you all to come to the Greenway. We have been managing during the COVID-19 times. And so I don't want to read this all, but please, you can come safely enjoy the Greenway. We do thoroughly endorse Mayor Walsh's request for wearing, that includes wearing a face covering when in public and enforcing social distancing. We are, those of us who maintain the park follow very strict and guidelines about how we work safely in the park, and we have increased our sanitation during this time as well out in the park. So please do consider coming down for your own walk to see the blooms, and if it's not right away, if it's in another week or two, you will get to see the alliums that will be blooming then. So if I can answer any questions now, I'm happy to, and I'm thrilled that you took this walk with me down the Greenway. My email is at the bottom of this slide, so feel free to email me directly with your questions. And please do look at our website or follow us on any of these other platforms.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Darrah. We do have a few questions. The first is, in case you don't cover this during your presentation, what happens if you have ephemerals in an area that you later mow as lawn?
That's a great question. I struggle with that every year at home because we have a lot of the native bluets or Housatonia in my yard. I wish we could get some to grow as happily on the Greenway, and I'm always struck with that. So I try to restrain yourself from mowing as long as possible to give those plants, if be they bulbs or enough time to try to regenerate some of their food supplies. So you're definitely going to wait till they finish blooming, and then it's your call is as good as mine, really. They want to live until the foliage actually starts to yellow and go dormant. but you generally can't wait that long with the lawn. So some people will mow around them if they're in a clump. I don't have a straightforward answer. I know with some plants that they will continue to create just a shorter, if you can mow your lawn but higher, so 3 or 4 inches high, if that's satisfying. That lower part of the plant will definitely keep doing its job until it's ready to go dormant. So it depends a little bit on what else you're trying to manage by mowing your lawn.
Very good. Your fritillaria photos were great. This listener has not had success with fritillaria and wonders if you have any particular planting care tips.
So I do know that some of them seem short-lived and that they are very reliant on well-draining or dry soil after the bulb blooms. And I would also agree that just some species tend to do better than others. And so the smaller Fritillaria meleagris seem much less needy than other fritillarias. The other 2 tips I would say is that especially the larger, the fritillaria with the larger bulbs, one of the reasons they might not do well is that they tend to collect water and rot out. And so a tip I heard or have read, which has been helpful, is to literally plant them sideways, and to make sure that you might actually prepare the planting hole with some additional gravel and sand so that the bulb itself definitely has better drainage. That being said, I would say that the Fritillaria meleagris is a great beginner's fritillaria because I think it's much more reliable. And that one Fritillaria radiana, which is that sort of pale greeny yellow color, I would give that one a try if you want to give a large flowering fritillaria a go again.
Okay, very good. You mentioned that you plant tulips in your containers after Halloween. Do you then overplant them with holiday decorations?
So what I do in the ones where I want a lot of tulips is that rather than planting winter items in there, I just use cut winter greens, and those will hold up really well. So I plant the tulips. I try to get them a good 4 to 5 inches, the tops of the tulips 4 to 5 inches below the soil, and then use cut holly or fir boughs, so if you need to stick something in the soil, you have a little bit of soil to work with before you might jam it in a tulip bulb. I do find that you have to plant those bulbs in the containers very closely to get a good show in the spring. Literally just side by side by side by side. And if I have a evergreen that needs to be planted in the pot, I would sort of do that at the same time as you're putting the bulbs in. But I've tried to move just to using cut greens.
Good suggestion. With the many areas that you have large swaths of bulbs, what do you do to overplant the area once they pass?
So ideally or generally, we will have already put in the perennials, and then the bulb planting follows the perennial planting. So the bulbs are planted between the perennials, and the perennials, whether they are rudbeckia or daylilies or you name it, they're all going to grow up, come up with, around the bulb foliage. In some cases, you need to go in and cut the bulb foliage back a little prematurely. If but generally it will sort of fade away. We have gained a tolerance for, so again, we have a big park with a lot of area to manage, so we may manage it a little differently than you would if it were a smaller bed, you know, even a 20 or 30-foot bed at your home, where you may want to deadhead the narcissus that are trying to set seed, and you may want to try to manage that bulb foliage. But we just leave it and live with it looking a little yellow as the other plants grow up around it. And then it collapses underneath them, at which point we might rake it out if it's exposed in some areas. There are a few areas where once it starts yellowing, so it hasn't gone completely dormant, we will go in and cut it back, cut it back. Does that answer that question?
Yes, thank you. In the area where you planted the large metal tubs with tulips, were the tubs filled all the way to the bottom with soil, or did you have some sort of spacer?
Those tubs are filled completely with soil. We were able to do that when we first put them in. You certainly would not need that much soil if in them. So you could put a false bottom in and the bottom third of the pot if you wanted to.
And in those same planters, how much of the soil do you remove and refresh, or what do you do to manage the soil from year to year?
We do not annually remove any soil. We sort of add, I do top dress the soil with compost or a little mulch from time to time, so that will add some nutrition by top dressing with a little compost just to make it look neater. And the soil is sort of slowly shrinking. But what does happen with those hybrid tulips is that they then get pulled out for the sort of summer planting. And at that time, we will inevitably need to add additional soil. If the soil is looking very tired, I might remove an extra 2 or 3 inches and add in new soil. But we certainly do not change out all the soil all the time, and many of the containers have shrubs and or trees, small trees in them that that have been in there for 3, 4, or 5 years. And so it's only when one of those is failing that we will then replant the whole container.
All right, very good.
We have been very lucky being a relatively new park. We have very few pests that dig up our bulbs. So that was certainly something to consider that we have not had to deal with very often. We've had a few bad years of rabbits, and they have gone after tulip bulbs and some of the crocus, but only in 1 or 2 spots where their population was high.
You mentioned pest bunnies, and this person wants to know, what about pest dogs or people destroying park areas?
So those are definitely challenges. I don't know that they particularly apply to these plants especially. People are very respectful of the bulbs in the sense that they're so happy to see something blooming every spring. They're just in awe of them. So I would generally say that the people are more of an issue with shrubs and sometimes perennials, by walking through the beds and breaking shrub branches and forming desire lines, little paths if they're trying to take shortcuts. And certainly wherever they're walking, like anywhere, if it's stepped on multiple times, it's just not going to grow. So that's why you end up with this path. And so that's unfortunate, and it is sort of, it does happen in the park. And the dogs are not digging up the plants. The dogs are more of a nuisance to the gardeners, in the sense that we sometimes have to pick up after them, which we don't appreciate. And they do some damage in the lawns where they tend to dig, but even if someone is not good about keeping their dogs out of the beds, they certainly have been pretty good about not letting their dogs dig in the beds. So that would be my answer there.
Okay, very good. Can you give us a little more information about the size of the meadow by the highway? And also, what did you do when you planted the seeds to keep the birds from eating them?
Let's see. So the meadow is about 7,000 square feet. What do I want to, I can't think of some equivalent area that, might be I don't know. So how can it's about the same size as the area that the labyrinth was in, if that gives you another sense. So large, but not too large. And let's see, and the other question was regarding seeding the meadow?
Right. Was there anything particular that you did to prevent birds eating the seeds?
And so not beyond what you would typically do when you're seeding a lawn. I mean, we raked it in lightly. We installed the seed in, I think, late November. So it was late in the year. And we put down a wide open jute erosion mat, which certainly didn't keep the birds out of it. And we did see some birds in it. Mostly we have sparrows along the Greenway, and they were clearly eating something, but it was a mix of probably 20 different wildflowers. And so while they may have been eating one or two species, anyways, I didn't notice a huge lack of anything the next spring. So whatever they were eating, there was plenty of seed in the ground to accommodate them. But we did, as I say, a light raking, and I think we rolled it for contact, with one of those rollers. And it was small enough area that it wasn't, overwhelming to go through it, with basically a hand push machine. So we didn't have to use heavy machinery on it because it was acres and acres. While we're on the subject, not of the meadow, but before I forget, I do want to list a couple of sources for plants. If no one has asked, I will say that we buy many of our bulbs through Brent and Becky's bulbs, and we also buy from a company called Sheepers. They both sell wholesale, but I think they both also accommodate retail purchases. And then for plants, I would recommend, I think I mentioned it before, the garden shop at Garden in the Woods, which is sponsored by the Native Plant Trust. And then we could also mention two mail order nurseries here. These are more for retail customers: Toad Shade Nursery and Wood Thrush Natives, who both will do mail order and sell sustainably grown native plants.
Very good. Thank you. We did have a couple of questions about sourcing, and you've just taken care of that. With all of the urban stresses that you have, but your native plantings how are you doing attracting birds and pollinators to the Greenway?
We're doing a very good job, and we're also actively monitoring and encouraging birds and pollinators. So we have part of our horticulture program is called the pollinator ribbon. And so while we may have parks that are planted 50% with native plants and 50% non-native, the pollinator ribbon pockets or sections are planted with a higher percentage, although not always exclusively in native plants. And so we're very aware of these things, and we're, as I say, actively working to support the pollinators. And our plant health care staff member is keenly aware of the life cycles of the insects and adapting our management and care practices to facilitate and support the insects and other pollinators. And our bird population is growing. We have an avid bird observer who walks the park every day, and I think on one of the rare times I ran across him that he said he has listed, I think it was 42 different species of birds on the Greenway, and he reports his findings regularly to the Cornell, one of the Cornell ornithology lab or website. So I'm not the bird person on our staff, but we have had a few bird people on our staff, and I feel like we're doing well. We also have found we've had an owl or two and a hawk or two. So we run the gamut from small sparrows up to larger birds.
Very good. You mentioned the native cactus. Can you tell us what that plant name was?
Opuntia humicifera. So it's in the prickly pear cactus family. Opuntia is the genus, and I'm sure if you Googled New England native prickly pear or New England native opuntia, you would find it. And it's actually seems common, or it's along the seashore, in that it grows in very, very sandy soil, but astoundingly can go sort of dormant and flat and looks dead or ugly in the winter, and then it, like a phoenix, it sort of comes back to life every spring and puffs out and looks wonderful.
Excellent. When you start a new area for narcissus, do you plant them very tightly, or do you allow room for them to multiply?
So I have to answer in two ways. If you are going for a clumped look as opposed to a spread out sweep or drift look, that would make a difference, in which case you would plant them more tightly. I would say that we generally have planted generously, so even for the drifts, we will plant them closer together than you might have to, especially to achieve a drift over time. But it's rare. There are only a few areas now where I would say, and this is in some of the earlier planted drifts, where they actually are looking crowded. So I have yet to see whether we'll have to go in and actually thin the drifts that we have. So I would say that often in a large scale drift, we might be planting them about 4 inches or 5 inches apart. I do often, just for ordering purposes, a lot of the bulb catalogs will have a recommendation for a per square foot count. So in other words, they might say you want 3 per square foot, or for smaller bulbs, they might say you want 10 or 9 or 15. And I often use that type of spacing, or because then I know I have approximately, 100 square feet. I'm going to need whatever, 300 bulbs for that area. So I found that that's a helpful information. There's always more helpful information than you think in the catalogs and website listings. So check it out. And always ask who you're buying from. If you have questions, they're willing to give advice as well.
Very good. Can you let us know how you manage the vinca without it becoming invasive?
This is the, let's see, I was worried about that. This is a new vinca planting. It is the only area on the Greenway where we have vinca. And so I think that I would be better asked this question in another year or two. I suspect that we certainly have ample ability to limit its growth so that it won't spread beyond where we need it. It's in a contained bed, so it's running right up to some granite ledges, so we'll only have to monitor its growth in one direction. I will say that I was hesitant to put it in because I had lived in the Pacific Northwest where we basically considered it a weed and wanted to get rid of it everywhere for that very reason, that it was difficult to maintain and control. And so, but I think given the tough growing circumstances and the benefits that it provides, I think the amount of maintenance that will be required in this relatively controlled space is acceptable.
Okay, very good. Can you give us just a quick refresher of what your fertilizer regimen is on the Greenway and in particular for the bulbs?
So we do not do any fertilizing that is particular to the bulb. So we do not pre-fertilize the newly planted areas, and we do not regularly fertilize any areas of the Greenway except the lawns. We will add amendments if they seem particularly necessary after a soil test or because of a certain plant condition, but that's very rare. We do, however, apply a compost tea to add to the soil biology, and we have applied a compost, let's see, our mulch has been amended with some additional compost, so that our goal has been to increase the organic matter in the soil rather than adding specific nutrients. And we now are using a leaf mulch, a leaf mold mulch in most of the Greenway, which is adding those nutrients as they break down. There are a few cases where we've added a yucca extract to address a dry soil that won't retain water, and so we do not do regular fertilizing with a prepared fertilizer on the Greenway.
Okay, very good. Thank you so much for answering all of those questions. And what a delightful walk in the garden this has been, Darrah. It's been wonderful to see all of your stunning photographs, and thank you so much for guiding us through the magic and magistry of spring.
Oh, well, you're very welcome, and thank you again for the whole series. So, Penny, have a great afternoon, and the same to everyone.